Hello YouTubers, welcome to Big Buddha is Watching. I'm Big Buddha and welcome to the fourth film in my Peter Jackson marathon. And today I'm going to be looking at Heavenly Creatures. Fourth film in the marathon, his fourth debut, and after the Schlockfest trilogy that encompasses his first three films. This was a real change of pace. I mean, I can't think of another director who has changed tact when it comes to their own output. Quite as I can't think of another director who's done a 180 of this magnitude. Really. I'm sure there are others out there, but to go from making these almost juvenile movies, splatter movies, to producing a work of the maturity of this film, it was quite something to behold, really. And I think when it came out in 1994, it really hammered home that Jackson was a filmmaker to watch. This was the one that really proved that. I think film critics at the time got a sense that there was like I said, a talent behind his first three films that was more than just somebody producing almost Troma-esque works. But the Heavenly Creatures was the film that kind of proved his mettle, if you like, as a filmmaker, and that he could not only attempt to do something vastly different and far more adult and more mainstream in a funny sort of way, but that he could actually pull it off. I know. I know a lot of entertainment-based directors do try the more serious films. If you look at a lot of filmmakers' canons, there's always one in there that you can go, okay, that's the attempt to get taken seriously. But the fact that Jackson actually managed to pull it off to the level that he did with Heavenly Creatures is quite something. I think with Spielberg, for example, it took him 2 or 3 attempts. I mean, not that to be taken seriously. Not that The Color Purple and Empire of the Sun are failures in any respect, but I don't think it was until Schindler's List that the movie going public and his critics really sort of stood back and went, okay, you've nailed this one. Whereas with Jackson, his first attempt at a serious work, was one of the most critically acclaimed films of the year, and arguably probably still his most critically acclaimed film to date. Of course, The Lord of the Rings got its plaudits, but they were criticised as well by they're not entirely perfect. The Lord of the Rings films, there are things you can pinpoint as being failings. I'll get onto them, I'm sure, when I talk about those films. Too many endings or what have you. But those films were never the critical darling that this one was back in 1994. The story of Heavenly Creatures concerns the Holm Parker murder case that took place in 1954, where Pauline Yvonne Parker, along with her close friend Janet Marion Holm, murdered Parker's mother in a park in Christchurch, New Zealand, and it was a sensational scandal at the time. So kind of I guess the equivalent of what the Jamie Bulger murder would have been in the 1993. It kind of shook New Zealand society to the core when it happened, because I mean, there's murder stories happen all the time, but the fact that the two perpetrators were only 15 and 16 at the time, when murder happens, it's that much more shocking when it's with minors, because we like to think that what separates us from the savages is our own moral compass, and we like to sort of label things that people who transgress and commit murder as evil. That's the only way we can sort of rationalise it to ourselves, that something like that can happen. But when it happens with children, I think it's a lot harder for people to wrap their heads around, because how can you truly demonize children if it aren't children innocents? But there you go. A really fascinating case. Juliet Hulme and Yvonne Parker. She's Pauline Parker, but she was I think she was referred to as Yvonne, because that was her middle name. Reaper or Parker, depending on who you ask. They were school friends. They'd known each other for a couple of years at the time. Hulme was actually an English girl. She'd come over with her parents from New Zealand, and they were a middle class family, whereas Hulme was from a more sort of lower middle class, working class background. They ended up in going to the same school, and they bonded over their love of films and film stars. They really liked James Stewart, James Mason. They were sort of eerily fascinated by Orson Welles, who they saw as a bit of an ogre. And they really liked the music of the opera singer Mario Lanza, and both had aspirations to write. They wanted to be writers, go to Hollywood and write film screenplays and produce films, and have Mario Lanza do the soundtrack and James Mason to star in the films. And interesting enough, I don't want to hark on about the true life story too much, because both these women are still alive, and you can look them up, but both are still alive now. And Holmes living under a pseudonym. She actually did have a career as a writer. And Yvonne Parker is she came after the murder. Basically, what happened was their parents and their peers were worried that the two girls were becoming too close, and there was a fear at the time that their relationship had spilled over into a homosexual one, although Holmes denied this in interviews. She said that their friendship was just one of obviously love for each other, but it was never sexual. She said she didn't even know what a homosexual was at the time, and a lot of the film version of Heavenly Creatures is cribbed from Parker's diaries. Am I getting the names right? Yes, Parker's diaries, and there's certain sections in that where it could be read that the pair may have had something bordering on a sexual relationship, but whether this was an actual sexual relationship they had, or whether it was merely both girls' burgeoning sexuality happening in conjunction, and curiosity and experimentation. Who knows, but certainly when the murder of Parker's mother happened at their hands, which happened because they feared that they were going to be separated. Parker's mother wanted to separate them because she felt their relationship was unhealthy. The lesbian thing was something that the tabloids harked upon because I guess there's a compunction when a murder happens to demonize them, the murderers, in some way, and anything that they can latch onto. Homosexuality at the time in New Zealand was seen as a mental illness. I don't know if it was ever a criminal act like it was in the UK, but it was something that you could get sectioned for, and so the lesbian aspect of the case was something that the tabloids really focused in on as a way of explaining and why, one of the reasons why this terrible crime happened. These two girls were mentally ill. They must have been, because they were so infatuated with each other. Jackson's take on the material is that he wanted to strip away the sensationalization of the story that had happened since the 50s, so over the 40 years since the crime took place. It had been sort of it had taken on almost gothic proportions. It regularly appeared in journals, the world's worst murders, the world's most horrific murderers, all these sort of trashy books that you see lining bookshelves everywhere. The Holm Parker murder is kind of a mainstay of them, and it was his wife Fran Walsh who wanted to do a film about this case, and they went, and they didn't base their screenplay on any pre-existing book or anything. They actually did their own research, which I found really commendable, that they actually took the time to go and track down their old classmates and teachers and speak to their families. I don't know if they ever spoke to the actual women themselves, but they didn't. They actually put the hours in and did the footwork, trying to track down these people who were directly involved in this case. And I think the screenplay for Heavenly Creatures really benefits from that legwork and that kind of the hands-on nature of the legwork and of the research and the first-person nature of the research, because it feels, this screenplay, very much like it doesn't feel one level removed. It feels like they really did a good job at humanizing these characters and making them identifiable. Just quickly check my notes. Oh no, that's my, sorry, that's my review for Crooklyn. It just said semi-autobiographical. Was it? I haven't reviewed Crooklyn yet. So yeah, as I say, this was a change of pace for Jackson, and I can tell it's kind of after you have two films, Meet the Feebles and Brain Dead, which he collaborated with a couple of other writers. This is the first time that he shares sole screenwriting credit with his wife. It was just the two of them credited on this one, and you can kind of I think Fran Walsh really did a good job on those films of shaping them into coherent works and making them feel like proper movies. And I kind of get the sense that after those two screenplays, she kind of went to him and said, "Okay, I've done two for you. Now you want to do. Now can you do one for me?" I don't know if that's the case, but it feels very much like he's making this as because his wife wants him to, but not that he isn't invested in the material, and there's certainly elements of Heavenly Creatures that very much feel like Jackson's own, and very and you can see why he would want to tell this story, because on the one hand you do have the real world murder case, but there's also this other element to it which feels very much like Jackson territory, because the two girls actually in real life, they actually invented almost their own religion, and they came up with this fantasy world together, and they actually wrote books set in this fantasy world. I believe it's called Barovnia, their fantasy world, and they had characters that they created for this world who they called saints, and they would create these characters together and actually make models of these characters out of clay. And there's strong fantasy elements in the film where you see Jackson actually brings the world of Barovnia to life. So after they've created the characters and set it all down on paper, these fantasy elements start creeping into the film. There's a scene early on where they're at the beach and they've built a castle, and then there's a panning shot through the castle, and then you get some very early CGI where the world around them morphs into this lovely lush garden, and these two big butterflies fly over the top of the two girls, and it it looks kind of like I say, it looks kind of a bit dated now, that the CGI. I'll come on to Jackson and CGI more as these films progress, and his move away from practical effects to his reliance on CGI. And if I had a preference which I prefer, the practical effects Jackson or the CGI Jackson, it would definitely be the practical effects, because there's more weight and heft to his aesthetic there. But there is practical work in these films, because there's various sequences set in the girls' fantasy world of Barovnia, and the clay characters that the girls invented come to life in the film, and they have dances, they have balls with these characters where they're dancing with these big human-sized figures who look like they've been carved out of clay, and an early indication later, sort of halfway through the film, that these characters' fantasy world is starting to spill over into the real world, and because there's a scene where Juliet's at one of her psychiatrists, and he's talking away, and then all of a sudden the psychiatrist gets staked through the middle, and of course it's a fantasy sequence, but an indication there that the fantasy world spilling over into the real world, and it could turn violent. um, yeah, it's like I say, it's an expertly structured screenplay, much like Brain Dead. I felt was an expertly structured screenplay. You know, you start off seeing the murder, and then the rest of the film's shown in flashback, which is a great touch because I think expertly structured screenplays sort of they immerse you into the world in one respect, but in another respect, the story drags you along because can almost you're almost waiting for what's coming on the horizon. So throughout the story, you know that that's where the film's heading. You know that that's where these characters are heading towards murder, and so everything that happens doesn't seem redundant in a funny sort of way. Everything that happens to these characters, you kind of go, oh, okay, I can see where they're heading, and why this happening would eventually lead on to events that happen later on in the film. And whereas if you didn't know where this story was heading, if you didn't have that first scene and being the last scene also in the film, then you might not have be engaged in the story so much. The film stars Kate Winslet as sorry, I do keep forgetting the names. It's very unprofessional. So the film stars Kate Winslet as Juliet and Melanie Lewinsky as Pauline. This was Kate Winslet's debut feature. I believe she'd done stuff on British TV before that, children's TV, Casualty, what have you. I actually remember her vaguely from a short-lived sitcom called Get Back, which starred Ray Winston, written by Lawrence Marks and Maurice Gran. So obviously it was shit, but I don't know how I'm not surprised it only lasted one season, because the premise of it was about the recession, which so it wasn't going to stay relevant for forever, doing a comedy series, a sitcom about the recession. But it was about a sort of working class kid done good, Ray Winston, and he'd obviously had money and lost it all and had to move back into his dad's council flat with his family. And I think there was a lot of some Beatles references in it. I seem to remember, his wife was called Michelle, and I think Kate Winslet's character was called Jojo. If anybody remembers Get Back, or if it's just me, then be free to let me know in the comments section. But yeah, I mean, like I say, this was her debut feature, and she was a real find. Both the girls were real finds, and if you look at the real life Parker and Holm, there's a physical similarity there, as well as these two being very charismatic actresses and having great chemistry on screen together. But it was it was obvious right from the get-go that Winslet was a real find, and obviously she's still an A-lister to this day. And Lewinsky didn't go on to the heights that Kate Winslet did, obviously, but I think she had a quite good career. I think she was in 2.5 Men, for years and years and years. I'd have to take other people's words from that. I think I've seen like an episode and a half of, or maybe 2.5 episodes of Two and a Half Men in my time, but not a lot. Yeah, 2.5 episodes was enough. But funny enough, actually, the two performances, I'd say I probably prefer Lewinsky's. Actually, I think she's very good and very likable and very spunky in the role, and she plays the more relatable teenager in a way, because she is moody and off in her own world, and you get more. I guess you see more of her story. You get more of her family. You see her lose her virginity to the lodger that the parents have taken in. It's actually quite a funny scene. Winslet's the more precocious character. She's very posh, very clipped tones, very precociously bright, but one of these characters that you suspect is maybe not quite as bright as they think they are. I don't know if that's fair to say. But just back to the fantasy elements. The fantasy elements kind of juxtapose the character development in this film. This film could be seen as a coming of age story, and obviously you follow the characters from when they're 14 to 16, and so you get this. So it is, whether you like it or not, it is a film about burgeoning sexuality and sexual awakening, and how that manifests itself, and and sort of it's sort of about the last days of childhood in a way, and the onset of adulthood, and the real world taking over, and the real world kind of comes into these two characters' lives, and they're when they're least prepared for it, and it, obviously affects the rest of their these characters' lives forevermore. But the film, it doesn't deal with the trial or anything. It just deals solely with the two characters' relationship from the time they meet up until the murder. And the film sort of is bookended by the murder. It starts with the murder and the ends with the murder. And it's the actual murder scene. It's very respectfully done. It's not sensationalized at all. I think it's Jackson, who can be a show-offy director. I think he wisely exercised restraint in shooting the actual murder scene in a very documentary fashion, and I know he wanted to be respectful. He did use the actual location where the murder took place, but I think out of respect for the deceased and not wanting to get too grisly or too eerie, I think he shot it, because it takes place on a path in a park. I think he actually shot it a few hundred yards away from where the actual murder took place, simply out of respect for the dead and the families of the dead. And the final scene, a bit, as well, not wanting to be show off in the shooting of the murder scene. He does sort of compensate for that in the editing, because he juxtaposes the murder with shots of Kate Winslet's character leaving on a liner, and Melanie Lewinsky crying and saying come back, and I think this is meant to signal that this is the end. This is the end of childhood. This is the end of innocence in this section that happens, and obviously this is the end of the friendship. I think they know that the second that they've done it, that these two are never going to see each other again. And apparently they didn't. Apparently they went to prison for a few years, got out, and never saw each other again. It's said in the post-credit sequences that this was actually a condition of them being released, that they never saw each other again, although that's been denied by one of the judges in the case. So whether that's true or not, well, who knows. So yeah, Heavenly Creatures. It's an excellent film. It's analytically, I'd say it is. To date, from 1994, it was Jackson's best work. Maybe not the one I'd watch. I'd enjoy most, sure, but this is this is a channel for cinema analysis rather than fanboy gushing overall. So I'll give this 4.5 stars out of 5 because in my heart I know it's a more accomplished all-round work than his first 3 films. It's an excellent film. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. And I'll leave it there. So thanks for staying with me for my ramblings on Heavenly Creatures, and until next time, folks, I'll see you all out there in YouTube land. This is me, Big Buddha, signing off.